Okay, welcome to Straight Facts and Queer Thoughts with Beyond the Bell Tours. Today we're doing a series of talks about figures from queer history and what has formed our city that we know and the people who we look to when we're thinking about our city in the future, now in quarantine, the places we hope to return to, and the people who've made them happen. And today we're really lucky to be joined by Michelle Angela Ortiz, Louie Ortiz-Fonseca, and David Acosta. They all have relationships with Gloria Casarez in different shapes and forms. And so we're going to pay a tribute to Gloria Casarez today through their stories about her and talk about her life and legacy. So I want to start by welcoming David and ask you to introduce yourself a little bit and talk about how you founded Galay, and then how you met Gloria through your work in the queer Latinx community.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, and Michelle and Louie, great to see you both. I am currently the artistic director for Casa de Duende, which is an arts organization focusing on the importance of the work that artists do at the intersections of both just art, but also social and economic justice work. And I've been pretty active in several communities for many, many, many years. In the late 80s, I started GLAY, the Gay and Lesbian Latino AIDS Education Initiative, as a way to address the HIV epidemic among Latino gay and bisexual men. At that time, the word MSM wasn't really in vogue. That came later. GLAY was founded in 1987. It wasn't incorporated until 1988, 89. Its gestations were a little earlier through a program called Esfuerzo, which was administered by Congreso de Latinos Unidos. I was hired there to develop a program to reach young bisexual men. I entered the program and began to develop programs which were asset-based, meaning that I wasn't looking to rectify any deficiencies in terms of gay men and their lives. It really was to inform them from an asset-based perspective, a perspective of pride, a perspective of joy, a perspective that wasn't really looking down on them and their lives. This positive spin on being queer or gay or was not settling well with the power structures at Congreso at that time. And so I decided that I couldn't really do the work under the circumstances and kind of under the rubric that they wanted me to work to have. A lot of the work that we were doing obviously was education around sex and the risks of sex without condoms, and so I felt that we needed to really address gay male sexuality from, again, an asset-based perspective, not a shame-based perspective. And I don't think that the management at that time of Congreso was happy with my direction and my ideas for the program. So I basically left and took the program with me, and then started it at small desk at the AIDS Activities Coordinating Office. Those were difficult first years because there was very, very little funding. The funding didn't really increase. And then through fire and tribulation, I was able to secure some funding to begin some of the programs that eventually were established. One of the first programs that we had at Calais that was sort of outside of any of the programs that came later was the Midnight Cowboy Project, which particularly focused on the education of sex workers around the issues of HIV and AIDS. And we would do late night outreach. And again, we approached this from a very non-punitive, a very asset-based perspective, knowing that, sex work is work, and that people were going to make a living doing that, regardless of what we told them. And so what we wanted to do was share messages with them around risk reduction and harm reduction. Then eventually when we received some funding, we were able to begin a youth program. And then I think about a few months after the funding came in, I realized that I needed to get someone to come in and take and run that program. So that is when I put out an application for a position, an announcement for a position, and we had several folks who came and applied, and Gloria was one of those individuals. And I knew Gloria and Gloria's work from her Empty the Shelters work that she had been doing on Lehigh Avenue and other work, certainly from her work at Westchester University. And so she came with a lot of good baggage, I would call it. She came with her own little toolkit, a toolbox. And I think, just talking to her, I think within like maybe half an hour, I knew that I would offer her the job. And I did, but she gladly accepted. And so that's kind of the beginning of Gloria's work at LA.
Wow, that's incredible. How did the program that was mostly based in the community of sex workers parlay into the youth program? And I wonder if you could speak, when we talked earlier, you mentioned that when you met Gloria, and now you say her good baggage she brought with her, you described you two as birds of a feather, kind of having a similar worldview about the ways that social and economic justice issues are connected. And so I wonder if you could talk about how these two issues are connected, and kind of, how the youth program took off.
Right. So the youth program became another program of Calais. I mean, Midnight Cowboy Project continued, and that was also run by a team that did street outreach, very late night street outreach. We worked, we had to work in tandem with the police to some degree. So our team wore very bright yellow jackets. Remember those yellow jackets, Louie? And they were not cheap because they had to be, really well insulated for the winter months. But they wore yellow jackets partially because they were recognizable. It said Midnight Cowboy Project on the back in Calais, and because also all of the precincts where we did work knew that those were outreach workers that were doing health promotion work around safer sex issues among sex workers, so that if there was to be any problem, they would not be either arrested or, that they would be safe. The youth program, again, came, in tandem with a much later, but was also just another program that we started at Calais. And then, so to speak to the issue of social and economic justice, I had come from a long line of activist work in the 70s and in the 80s with different communities, all of whom were very deeply rooted in ideas of social and economic justice. And so that's really the philosophy that informed my work, and that has always informed my activist work. And Gloria obviously came also with that same lens and kind of with those same ideas that, we needed to not only work to address the health conditions of individuals as regards the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but to also work in tandem to ensure that some of the other needs that these communities had were met. Because oftentimes it's not just our ability to address one issue. If people are hungry, they're going to turn to sex work. If people are homeless, they're going to go turn to sex work. Sometimes as tools of survival. So we realized that, we couldn't be throwing buckets of water out the window, that we really needed to address, communities holistically. And so part of that work needed to happen in tandem with meeting or trying to mitigate and address some of the other needs that they had: lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to housing, lack of access to unemployment, especially with sexual minority communities, transgender communities, and so forth. And so eventually we began to address women's health issues and obviously trans issues on the trans program, which was getting started when I left LA, and which Gloria took on.
That's amazing. Thank you for laying that out. And it's, as you're talking, I'm seeing like Gloria Casarez residence and kind of the legacy in the physical city today of some of these programs that I want to get into eventually. But first, Louie, I wanted to ask you, you grew up in Philly and eventually came on to the team at Galay working on the youth program. Can you talk about what it was like to work with David and Gloria in those days?
It's actually 25 years ago this July. July 8th was my day as a Galay employee, and was kind of like pulled in by Steve Rivera, who was already a peer youth educator there at the first iteration of the youth program. It was more outward facing, more like training adults and doing presentations in schools. When Gloria came on, it was a more flushed out vision of what that youth program was, and it was called Youth Program. And that was in 1995, so it was an interesting time because it was right on the cusp of what the second wave of the AIDS epidemic was. When people think about the AIDS epidemic, they tend to think about the early 80s. And I think definitely at the onset of the epidemic, what is something that still needs to be highlighted. But I think visually and even in terms of data, like who it impacted was very different in 1981 than who it was impacting in the early 90s, right? It was very gay men-centric, stealing the lives of majority gay men. That was the outward facing, but by the 90s, it was clear that it was a Black and brown issue that ravaging communities, both straight and gay. So I came in at that time, right before the advent of breakthrough medication. So I can remember trainings that I was given before medications versus after. Wow. And that framed and continues to frame how I approach my work. Because when I started Galay, I was a 7th grade dropout. I don't know what David saw in me. I can remember in the interview, and he was like, "Are you in school?" And I was like, "No. Why would you even ask that?" I'm out doing stuff. So I think that getting joining, being given the opportunity as a 7th grade dropout, as someone who grew up with parents who struggled with addiction, but also because my parents struggled with addiction, I had this room to explore my identity in a way that a lot of my friends didn't, right? I didn't have expectations to be straight. I don't have a coming out story. It was kind of like we were so marginalized both by society and our family that the expectations were very different. So when I came on to Galay, it was pretty in concert with what my friends were, what my mom's friends were doing. They were sex workers, they were trans women, they were gender non-conforming people, even though that language wasn't around at that time. So watching people do the Midnight Cowboy Project, and I remember part of the orientation at Galay that you had to do I think a week outreach. I would go out there late at night. It was very odd to start your work shift at 10 p.m. And going into the park. So that kind of, again, framed, I was like 17, 18. It framed like what my adulthood would look like as a queer Latinx person, right? Mm-hmm. And also what made that time, looking back, exciting is that there were not a lot of people focusing on this community. There were not a lot of queer Latinx folks. Like, it was like finding Waldo. Like, if you went to a club and you saw another gay Latino there, you can make a clear bet that they were not from Philly. They were always from out of town. So I think when I met Gloria, it was right before I was leaving Galay, right, because the youth program was starting to gain some steam, and we had lost funding. I can't remember who. I'm not going to say any names. City agencies that give you money, they remain nameless. But I remember David saying, "Give me the summer, I will find money, and it would be bigger and better." But in that time, I met Gloria because she was brought on to lead a project that was supposed to be the youth center of the minority youth center of Philadelphia. And I was one of the ambassadors, and that's how I met Isis, who was still a great friend of mine, actually defended my son when we had a case that makes the world go round. But the project stalled because of politics and stuff that happens in the 90s before the advent of social media. Because I think if we had social media, then we could have definitely made our case, but people were in power back then. But me and Gloria connected. Again, there were not a lot of Latinx queers doing the work, and certainly not, and those who were doing the work, not as politically, I don't want to say progressive, but like really talking about sex in a way that wasn't demonizing, right? And again, this is at the height of the epidemic. So some people talked about sex as something to be wary of, where David, folks at the Minacabo Project, Galay, and myself talked about it like from this very pleasure perspective, which in 1995 was like, y'all are wild, get that out of my face and don't bring that into my schools. So me and Gloria connected immediately. And then when that project fell through, I went on to work at Colors, which is the Black gay organization in Philadelphia, and it still had strong ties to Galay. And Gloria came on board as the youth coordinator of reaching adolescents via education. So we kind of like developed professionally in that kind of way, but also still very connected to Galay. Like, Galay was part of the genesis of our work. Like, it was an introduction, like thinking outside the box in terms of what HIV as a social justice issue can look like. And, and I would eventually wind up coming back to Galay under Gloria's leadership. She brought me back in the winter of 1999. I remember because I bought Mariah Carey's Rainbow.
Wow.
The same week that I started. It was in November. And we just stayed friends throughout that time, eventually became roommates with her. And just developed as adults in that kind of way, but still staying connected to the work that bonded us, that introduced us. And, as I grew up, she grew up. And, I've always looked to her and David Acosta as mentors. And I think when people hear mentors, they think adult and young person. It wasn't necessarily like that for me. It was kind of like I was this North Philly kid who was a 7th grade dropout and had everything set up against him. But the mere introductions to both Galay, Gloria, and David, like, really shifted the trajectory of my life. And that continued. And even when I began to do Grabadones, almost 6 years ago, I went back and I was like, David, I need you to be a part of this. Gloria, I need some technical support. Like, what is this idea? Help me draw it out. I knew that I wanted to do storytelling, but did not know that was a thing. So I had to go back to the people I trusted. Like, it felt like I was stepping out on my own. Like, like it wasn't a project that wasn't connected to an organization. It was a project that I was doing, independently. And, you know, and even as the project grows, I'm always thinking about the connections I had to Gloria in terms of even of a historical context. Like it's the foundation of, you know, Gran Varones, which amplifies the stories of queer Latinx folks, to talk about and raise the histories that are not often told on Apple documentaries, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those histories are localized. A lot of those histories make way or help to create national movements, and I think the work of Delay and Gloria are a part of that. And it is definitely my mission to continue to elevate that, because it, not to be dramatic, saved my life, and I know what that kind of work can do, and I know what that kind of legacy means, and I know what it can mean for other young people to hear that, so that they can step into that kind of very visionary approach and begin to be mentors and support mechanisms of themselves. And one song, you know, when we were talking earlier, that reminds me of Gloria. I think I knew that when we were friends outside of work, because sometimes you're friends with people at work and you have to figure out, like, if I quit here, are we still gonna be friends? Gloria in 1997 was going away down south. I think she might have gotten some fellowship, I can't remember, and she had asked me to hang out. And I remember thinking, oh, because the youth center thing had fell through, it was, you know, stopped in its tracks. So, and she was just about to start Delay. So it was like this window, like the thing that introduced us no longer exists. So what does that mean for us, right? And I remember I was going to the gallery and going to the Wall, which was a record store. They were once a thing. And buying Notorious B.I.G.'s More Money, More Problems on CD single because it had a remix. And I think it was that day when we had lunch that I knew that we would be friends for life. Because it wasn't a meeting about a project. It wasn't a meeting about an event. And it was a meeting because she wanted to touch base with me before she went down south for the summer. And I think that for definitely a kid who grew up in North Philly who did not even know that downtown existed, to be connected to people who thought were change makers, and those change makers to think that I was a change maker, like shifted how I thought about myself. And I carry that throughout all the years that me and Gloria with friends. And I often say that it's weird when people talk about her like she's Diana Ross. It's like being Diana Ross's child. She's your mother, right? She's someone you love, someone very ordinary, and then you go out into the world and they talk about her in this grandiose way, and it's kind of like, so it's sometimes jarring because me and Gloria were like family, and to hear about her impact when in 1995 we weren't even sure what we were doing. We know that we had to do something, but to talk about that work almost a quarter of a century later is still disorienting to me, because I don't think that any of us thought that we were doing anything particularly magical as much as we were doing something in order for our communities to survive. So, you know, I'm like so proud to be part of that history. I'm proud to talk about Gloria because, you know, before the Gravarones kicked off, you know, she helped us come up with Our Legacy is Alive. You know, she helped me figure out what the logo was going to be. And there was no credit, right? Like, it's not something that you do, like, let me post on Facebook, because that's what we did in 1995, and it's what we did in 2014. So I hope that people know that about her, know that about her legacy. It's connected to other legacies, and the mural that exists, I think, encompasses that. And if people go to the mural and see all, they can see all of the legacies that Gloria is connected to, and all of the brilliant people that were connected to Gloria, and those histories that continue to shape the city, that continue to shape the LGBT community, and the legacies that continue to inspire folks like myself.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's a great transition to talking about how Gloria is monumentalized in the city. And so how people will meet her as we wander about or, take tours as Beyond the Bell does. And so, David, I wondered, you were on the committee for making the mural happen right as Gloria passed away in 2014. And I wondered if you could talk about that process of choosing Michelle to be the artist and working with her on the commission.
Right. So yeah, there were several people on the committee. Louie was on the committee as well as some other folks, Trisha and others. And so we basically, the Mural Arts Program has a process that they follow. They put out an RFP, a call for a mural for mural artists, and then designs of a mural, and then those come in, and then they are reviewed by the committee. And in this case, a lot of the folks were folks who knew Gloria and who had done work with Gloria throughout several facets of her life and her activist life. And I think that we also judge the proposals based on the strength of the idea of the work presented. Obviously, that has a lot of weight when you are trying to decide a mural, especially a mural that I think is meant to convey the presence of someone and the history of someone. And but I also knew that Gloria had admired and was a big fan of Michelle's work and Michelle's murals, other murals that Michelle had done. And so I think that that certainly bore some weight on our decisions to finally do that. But we also liked Michelle's approach to blending these very activist facets of Gloria's life into the mural so that people could understand it without necessarily having a narrative. It was a pictorial narrative. Later on, I would come to understand that there were other interesting connections between Michelle and Gloria, which I will let Michelle talk about. But it was great when those things came to light because we kind of realized that we actually had made, the best decision possible to have Michelle be the artist that would work on Gloria's mural.
So Michelle, can you tell us about those connections that later David and others learned about and we learned about from you the other day?
Yeah, well, first of all, to do the Gloria Casarez mural and to honor Gloria was just so amazing. And I felt that through the mural process, I knew Gloria in passing because there were several connections that way before even the mural concept happened, before she, was the liaison in City Hall, like way before all that happened. I found out through just talking with family and friends through this process that my parents actually knew some of her family. One of them being, I live in South Philadelphia where there were very few, you could count on our hand how many Latino families we could count on our hand, right? And so when my parents arrived, my father's from Puerto Rico, my mother's from Colombia, they both arrived at different points in Philadelphia, but they had a mutual family friend. His name was Don Pedro Cardenas. And Don Pedro, who we call Don Pedro, would be kind of our grandfather, right? So he actually walked my mom down the aisle. Wow. When they were married at La Milagrosa, which was the Spanish chapel on 19th and Spring Garden that unfortunately is no longer there, but there's so much history and connection there. That's where my parents were, they met in one of the events of La Milagrosa. They were married. I was baptized there. I was married there. Wow. And also Gloria's family has a very long connection along with that history of La Milagrosa. So it was really interesting was to really find those connections as I was learning more about her beyond her work as an activist, in our city. So for me, it was during the time that I was asked to see if I was interested in doing the mural. I'd just given birth to my son, and I was telling Louie that Gran Varones and my son were birthed at the same time. So I was a new mom, and I was also launching a very, ambitious project that I'm still continuing to work on, which is called My Familias Separadas project, which is around the stories of detention, how families are affected by detention and deportation. And I was starting to do that here in Philadelphia due to the high number of deportations that were happening nationwide, but also how our communities, specifically in the focus of the project is with Latinx communities and undocumented families, were targeted in my own neighborhood. And so it was definitely a huge risk in a sense of creatively of approaching installations, approaching installations that were not in a traditional mural form. And so it was during this time that, here I am launching this off. I have, just have a newborn, infants, learning how to be a new mom and managing this work. And so, to do this honor for Gloria it was such an honor for me. And I was like, well, I can't say no. So how can I make this happen? So when I was approached, I actually remember calling one of my, lead assistants, Brianna Dawkins. So hopefully she's watching. I want to give a shout out to her. So Brianna was a student of mine way back in mural corps. She was 13 and has been one of my lead assistants. I won't say how old she is now because then that would make me a lot older. But she was my right hand. And so I said to her, if you're able to help me through this process, I was creating the design, but also just the actual painting and implementation of the mural, then I said I can say yes. And so she said yes. We had an amazing team, and that's how we were able to accomplish the mural.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, and I think, the timing was mostly the biggest thing, but I also felt that for me, and why I said yes, obviously, like for me, Gloria continues to be such an amazing force of energy, right, in terms of the work that she has done. And I see all of the extensions of this work in David and Louie and all of the people that she's connected with. But I also felt a lot of pride as honoring a woman of color, honoring someone that one of the phrases that I never forget that Trisha Dressel, her wife, had shared with me was that, she always said, you never negotiate against yourself, so you never negotiate against yourself. And so it's one of those things that I hold on to, especially when I find myself trying to defend the integrity of the work that I'm doing in communities. And even with Gloria's story and Gloria's mural, how important it was not to just have the pristine photo of her, right, in her suit and jacket, but the mural itself has the images of her with the bullhorn and leading the Philadelphia Dyke March,